voted. You believe a word that Labour says now?
Well, today of all days, Vincent, I would hope that...
Oh, you thank God the abortion thing's come along and you can claim credit for that.
I would never be so crass as to say thank God.
You almost were in the press release.
No, I was about to say that today there is an example of a promise that has been kept.
Yeah, wonderful, isn't it?
Actually, I think it's a very good thing. I think it's a very good thing that that's something that we have managed as a government to make happen. I do think that's a good thing. I regret the fact that we made a promise on child benefit that we couldn't keep. I do regret that.
Okay, Caroline, do you think they're right to congratulate themselves on promising to legislate and then regulate for abortion?
No, I don't. And on the previous comments, which I know we're not really dealing with, I'd just say I thought that the cuts on the carers allowance of about 19% was literally off the wall. I think I agree with you entirely. I think they could have been a lot more creative where the greatest of need is and where the unsung heroes are this Christmas when we were seeing them outside the door. I think it's nothing short of a disgrace. And I think Enid O'Dowd, who I've seen on the television and I've followed her letters in the Irish Times, who's been criticising the lack of cuts in the politicians' own benefits, is also to be congratulated. Now, in relation to the abortion issue, which you've asked me about specifically, no, I do not think that they should be congratulating themselves. I, like every other woman watching this programme and every other person watching this programme, I'm concerned that women will know when they step into any maternity hospital in this country that they're entitled to receive the best of care, that they're entitled to receive every intervention that they need for any complication in their pregnancy, and knowing that they can also know that every effort will be made to preserve the life of their child they're carrying. I think that this decision to legislate for the X case isn't going to cover any of those things. That's already medical practice has always been. It's what puts us in the top 5 according to I think Labour anyway, certainly according to the Minister Riley, puts us in the top 5 countries in the world in terms of maternal mortality and standards in maternal care. I think what this does that's really different is we've crossed a Rubicon. We've now decided that there will be legislation, the purpose of which will be the targeting of the unborn and the ending of its life.
Targeting of the unborn.
Yeah,
the unborn
abortion
will be targeted.
The baby, absolutely. We're not simply talking about.
Every unborn baby will be targeted.
May I finish the sentence? We are not simply talking about medical interventions which are needed to deal with complications of pregnancy. They are already dealt with. We are talking about the acceptance, in the absence of medical evidence that is necessary, of abortions in order to treat, for instance, something like suicidality. There is no evidence anywhere in the world literature. There is no evidence.
The babies Vincent, in the womb will be targeted.
That's what abortion does.
This is targeting babies in the womb. This is what this does.
That is the difference
we've
between...
decided now that we're going to target babies in the womb, kill them all, like the...
No, not kill them all.
Massacre of the Innocents.
I know you're thinking it's Christmas and the Massacre of the Innocents. Well, there are some who would put it in those terms. No, what I'm trying to make... No, the distinction that I'm trying to make for you is this, Vincent. It is always something that we all want, that a woman will have whatever intervention she wants and she needs in pregnancy because of any complication. Sometimes that requires that the pregnancy is terminated. That's absolutely true. But there is a difference between terminating a pregnancy and a procedure the sole purpose of which is terminating the life of an unborn. And for instance, where we're dealing with the situation like in the X case, what the sentence I was beginning to say there is that there is nothing in the world medical literature anywhere which indicates that abortion is an appropriate treatment for suicidal ideation, for mental illness. Nothing. And why then, Vincent, on that basis, would a government propose to legislate for abortion?
I can think of a situation where it is entirely plausible that suicide would be an option for a woman who was horrified at the thought of giving birth, for instance, to the child of her violent rapist.
So can I.
Wouldn't you think that you could conceive a situation in which a woman would think that she would prefer to end her own life than allow her body to be used for the sustenance of a child brought about by a violent, awful rape of a horrific man?
Yeah, I can see that too.
So that you can genuinely envisage circumstances in which threatened suicide in such a situation would be valid, and that in order to deal with that threat to the woman's life, a termination of pregnancy would be appropriate. Let
me answer that to you this way. I put that exact scenario to an obstetrician within the last week who's very likely watching this programme. And I said to him, woman in that situation presents to you and she's 24 weeks pregnant. What do you do? And without hesitation he said to me, commit her. And I said, what? He said, commit her and give her the best psychiatric care and support possible. And I said, okay, I'm surprised that you would say that, because this person had been saying other things. And I said, and what would you do if the same person in the same situation presented herself to you in an equally distraught state at 20 weeks? Oh, that's different, he said to me. And I thought, well, why is that different? There's nothing different in terms of anything except that the baby is at a different state of gestation. And so he seemed to think that appropriate treatment...
No, it's terribly important. Onto something
no, it's
quite
not.
Different.
It's terribly important. Vincent, and I'll tell you why. I am Vincent, because how is it that a medical professional could indicate to me that the appropriate treatment for a woman who is suicidal 4 weeks later was proper psychiatric care, and 4 weeks earlier was termination. I'm telling you as a fact that nowhere in the medical literature, anywhere in the world, has it ever been shown that suicide
you agreed
is
with
appropriately
me
treated by
that
abortion.
it is plausible that a woman who had been violently raped and was horrified at the thought of her body being used for the sustenance of the child of her violent, horrific rapist, that might be suicidal, and that the only way of dealing with her suicidal tendencies was to terminate the pregnancy. Can you envisage that there would be such circumstances?
I've already agreed with you that that is plausible. May I continue? No, before you interrupt me, may I continue to say to you, but the psychiatrists who have been speaking over many weeks in the Dáil and in the media have made it absolutely clear that it's never possible in any given situation to say which woman will go through with such a threat and which one will not. And in fact, one woman did address the Dáil within the last couple of weeks who, in that situation, had actually kept the baby. So it's not possible. If it were, it's not possible scientifically to say who will commit suicide.
That you'd want to rule out absolutely a situation whereby a woman in such a situation could have an abortion, even though in some of those situations a woman would proceed and have die through suicide.
Vincent, you're a lawyer and I'm a lawyer, and we both know that very hard cases make bad law. I know that's a cliche.
It is a
cliche, but it's one that's been proven time and time again, in your own personal opinion perhaps. But the thing I would have to say is this: we have to look at the fact that the medical experts, the psychiatrists, are telling us that they cannot tell when they have a patient in front of them whether or not they're going to commit suicide. It's not, it's the fact. What is weak, Vincent, is that the Supreme Court made a decision on this basis in the absence of the psychiatric evidence, and that a government now proposes to legislate for abortion in an area covered by the X case, which would include a suicidal threat, where the entire world medical literature shows that in fact you're more likely to be suicidal after an abortion.
Kitty.
It's the law of the land, is it not?
Kitty.
Well, I mean, I suppose one way to test the validity of whether a threatened suicide is real or not is to wait and see. And I don't think anyone watching this programme would think that was acceptable.
But that's what Caroline is suggesting. Just wait and see.
I would wonder would anyone think that was an acceptable way to test the validity of this threat of suicide? To wait and see.
That's what you're saying, Caroline.
No, that's not true, Vincent. What I'm saying is...
No, are you saying... Tell us why you're not saying wait and see.
What the doctor... This is not the treatment that psychiatrists give to women who are suicidal.
No,
it is not appropriate.
But you are acknowledging that there are circumstances in which it would be plausible, or that
I'm
a woman
saying it would be possible. It is possible.
Yes, and the only way of knowing is wait and see, isn't it?
Given that it is
and the only way of knowing is wait and see.
It's not possible to tell. And the treatment which is given to people who are suicidal, pregnant or not, is proper psychiatric care. And the world literature, as I said, and will repeat,
you don't know whether the world literature says this.
I do. I know.
You don't. Different people say different things.
I know for a fact that you cannot
don't
produce
know for a
one.
fact.
I do. You cannot produce one study in the world literature that will show you that an abortion will remove suicidal ideation, because no such study exists. You can, on the other hand, produce several studies that will show you that abortion actually increases the risk of mental illness and the risk of suicide. Those facts.
Several psychiatrists in a letter to the Irish Times about a month ago said the opposite. Rather, said that what you said was untrue. What you've just said that what you said was untrue.
The studies that are there, that are world-class meta-analyses of hundreds of thousands of people, contradict that.
I don't think any report has found that there are long-term psychiatric effects of abortion.
But that's not true. But has any report that you know of found that it is a suitable treatment and removes the suicidal ideation, Kitty?
Can
you tell us about one, please?
I would say that the best test is the wait and see.
So you can't tell us about one. Thank you.
Well, could you tell us about one?
Pleased that you've scored a point there. What point did you think you scored?
that's no.
No, you said thank you, which usually in a situation like this suggests that you think you've scored a point. What point do you think you've scored?
Do you, Vincent? No, I was just trying to find out if Kitty could point to any study that showed that abortion was a treatment
are there any that
for
show
suicide
that there
ideation?
are long-term psychological effects of having an abortion?
There are several. Gissing, Ferguson and Coleman, for starters.
Who funded
Can I
them?
just make an observation here? If we actually look at the report of the expert group itself, the actual report says very clearly the X case decision is the law of the state as declared by its highest court. And in fact, you know, as a lawyer yourself,
Correct, yeah.
you know that.
Yeah.
And so we are here tonight saying that finally, after 20 years, we're going to make some legislation that will allow that ruling to have clarity.
Do you ever
women.
think that some Supreme Court decisions are wrong?
Well, I don't happen to think this is wrong. It's the law of the land. It's the law of the land.
Do you ever think some Supreme Court decisions are just wrong?
I don't think it matters what I think about this. The law of the land is the law of the land.
Susan,
I
can think of several Supreme Court decisions I think were wrong. In fact, one of them I can think off the top of my head was just bonkers, in my opinion, and that was the case where they found that a section of the Rape Act of the Sex Offences Act of 1935 was unconstitutional, therefore didn't exist. And a few weeks later, they put somebody to jail. They ordered somebody to be put in jail on the basis of a crime they said didn't exist. Now, that seemed to me to be crackers. Now, the fact that the Supreme Court says something it doesn't write it in stone. It does mean that we're stuck with it legally for a while till we change it.
Well, in this case, it is the law of the land. The European Court of Human Rights also, as you know, has said that that should have been applied, and we are now legislating for this. I happen to think that we need to provide clarity for doctors in cases where, you know, they are faced with a dilemma and they're trying to decide. It's very difficult if you're a doctor. I'm not a doctor, but I'm sure that it is very difficult. And equally for women, the women of Ireland, to have some clarity. And if we look, the real and substantial risk to the health of a woman is a very high barrier. It's a very high bar, don't you think?
I don't think that was the bar set in the X case.
A real and substantial risk
To the health of the mother, no.
Well, that is what we are talking about now.
I think it was.
It was a real and substantial risk to the life of the mother.
The life of the mother, sorry, the life of the mother, yeah.
To the health.
I'm sorry, you're right. The real and substantial risk to the life of the mother. And that certainly, as far as I'm concerned, that is what this is about, and I think that this is the right way forward for us. I think we need this clarity.
And if it is the case, Caroline, that suicide is, that it's not plausible that somebody who is pregnant would die by suicide because of the pregnancy. If that is so, then surely medical evidence would be adduced in any case that arose in the future to that effect, and therefore the termination of pregnancy wouldn't take place.
Vincent, in 2007, over 190,000 abortions took place in England and Wales. 97.5% of those abortions took place on the basis of effect on mental health. Does that answer your question?
No, it doesn't.
Well, it should. Do you think that they were all suicidal because two doctors accepted?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that all of those women, 97.5% of 190,000 women plus, you think that the two doctors who saw all of them were absolutely correct that they were all suicidal?
But suicide is
not...
That's not what you said. You said because of mental health problems. That's the way you framed the issue in the first instance.
Yes.
Now you've switched it to suicidal.
Yes.
Now explain why you switched.
Because this is the kind of ground, because we've been told by the psychiatrist...
Why did you ask me to put the question to me?
Let me answer the question before you answer me another question.
Did I know that in 92% of abortions in England... 97.5.
Thank you.
In abortions in England, that it was on the basis of two doctors affirming that abortion was appropriate because of mental health of the woman.
Yeah.
And then you changed the mental health then to suicide. Why did you?
Because that is the section under which suicide would be dealt with in the English Abortion Act. And given that we are told by our own psychiatrists that it's well nigh impossible to predict who is going to commit suicide, this is a ground which does leave the door
yes,
open
it's
for
important to predict
huge,
the future, yeah.
And sometimes, Vincent, it's impossible, and we've been told that it is impossible under this particular
of course
heading.
It is, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that being the case, isn't it highly likely that it is a ground which could be abused? Don't you think it might be?
And if denied, it's in a ground which a woman's life would end because of pregnancy and because of refusal of termination.
That's a possibility.
Yes, equally. Either is a possibility.
It's not equally, because everything points to the fact that it's not equally. That suicide in pregnancy is extraordinarily rare, is impossible to predict.
Okay.
This is a ground which is open to wide abuse.
Okay.
This is a ground which most people who are thinking about this carefully
women
are very unhappy
about.
about.
Women would lie about
Well,
it.
they've been told to lie about other things in the IFPA around the country. It's not unlikely that they've been told to lie about this. They've been told to say that they're having miscarriages when they come back from England if they've had abortions. They've been told that they can import morning after pills to the north of Ireland. Have you not been reading The Independent over the last few weeks? Of course, the Irish Times didn't report any of this. But there is an inquiry going on at the moment into advices given at some of the clinics around the country, which one obstetrician has said is absolutely reckless. I'm surprised that it's missed your attention, Vincent.
It has missed my attention, yeah, but your interesting switch in your argument earlier on didn't miss my attention. Kitty, just the controversy about termination of pregnancy has gained a lot of attention because of the death of Savita Halappanavar in Galway University Hospital. But of course, as far as we understand what happened in that case, what is now proposed with regard to the law on termination of pregnancies would have had no relevance to that case.
Well, I mean, of course, there are a number of inquiries underway into what happened in the case of Savita Halappanavar, but from what we've heard from her husband, Praveen, his interpretation, his take of what happened is that she deteriorated while she was miscarrying over a period of 4 days and having, as he says, she had asked for a termination over a period of 4 days, and this was refused, he says, because of the fetal heartbeat being still present, and they were told it's a Catholic country.
That wasn't being addressed. That issue is not going to be addressed.
That does not seem to be addressed, and this is the grey area, I suppose, that obstetricians talk about, that it's unclear when they can intervene. And yes, I mean, her health was clearly under threat in that situation. There's a tipping point, I suppose, but when her life was then under threat, which this is the area which I suppose the UN Rapporteur on Health, who was here yesterday, Anand Grover, was saying that legalising abortion would actually be a first step, and what's really needed is that there's safe and legal abortion when the health of the mother is under threat, not just the life, that access to adequate health care is a human right, and for women that involves access to safe legal abortions when their health is under threat. He did
Susan,
say that quite clearly.
I know it's not relevant to this particular to the legislation that's been introduced, but do you agree with that point?
That we should be looking for the real and substantial risk to the health?
Yes.
I'm not sure at this point. I would rather see this debate through in relation to what we're legislating for, because I think we're muddying the waters as we start to make progress down that line. I think that what we're doing here is seeking to legislate for the X ruling, and that's what we should be doing, and that is about the real and substantial risk to the life of the mother. I think if we were to change anything else, clearly it would have to go to a referendum, and the people will decide.
But just before I go back to Caroline, just to go back to the X case and the Supreme Court judgment in the X case, a lot of people, I think, reasonably would think that the basis on which they took that judgment, made that judgment, was pretty shaky, because there was only one psychological report, I think, produced in that case, and that in the High Court, the High Court judge, who was Declan Costello, thought that when you balance the certainty of the death of the unborn child with the possibility of the death of the mother, that you have to go with the protection of the unborn child, because the Constitution accords equal status to the life of the mother and the life of the unborn child. and therefore the Supreme Court judgment in the X case may have been bizarre. Can you see how people would think that?
I mean, I can see how all kinds of things are thought about all of this, because it's one of these challenging things that we've had such a long and tortuous debate about, and so I'm not surprised that people will constantly challenge that.
It's a reasonable point.
Well, I believe that at the time of the judgment, that the clinical psychologist who gave the evidence in High Court was, as far as I understand, a very senior clinical psychologist, and I believe that the Supreme Court, in its judgment, I believe made the right decision.
Okay, but the Constitution says that there's an equality in the right to life of the unborn,
yes,
with the right to life of the mother, and in that case, there was a certainty of an ending of life of the unborn child, with only a possibility of the ending of the life of the mother, and when you put a certainty against an uncertainty, you go for the certainty. And that because the Supreme Court didn't do that, as was done in the High Court, there's reason to be concerned about the validity, or rather, about the rationality of the judgment.
Well, except that, of course, with suicide, there is what do we do? Sit and wait? I mean, that's the difficulty with suicide. Yeah,
but we're caught with the
yes,
constitutional amendment of 1983. And which gives equal entitlement to the right of the unborn, right to life of the unborn child with the right to life of the mother. You're caught with that. Caroline?
But the duty to defend and vindicate it, as far as the child is concerned, the baby is concerned, is only as far as it's practicable. Sometimes it's not practicable. The point I wanted to pick up on, Vincent, was the point in relation to Savita Halappanavar and the sepsis in pregnancy and what might have been done there. Savita Halappanavar died of complications of a miscarriage, sepsis during the miscarriage, and there were screaming headlines in the Irish Times, in quotes, suggesting that a lack of abortion led to her death. It's instructive, I think, to have a look at sepsis in pregnancy. Sepsis in pregnancy, that's one case that we know about here. By 2008 in the UK, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists accepted and realised that the leading killer of women in pregnancy was sepsis. It was so serious, I think they have about one death every month. And I know that there were statistics for a 3-year period of 13 of just one bacteria alone, not the one that seems to have killed Savita. And in that case, in that country, abortion is freely available. So how did the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists address this problem, this leading killer of women in pregnancy? What they did was, in April this year, they issued new guidelines, additional guidelines, just called Sepsis in Pregnancy, instructing every obstetrician in the UK how they were to look out for the signs of and how they were to manage sepsis in pregnancy. All of the obstetricians in Ireland are members or fellows of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and they would be aware of the guidelines that have been issued this year.
Where's the guidelines of the UK body got to do with it? We're caught with Irish law, and that's it.
And why then are obstetricians hanging around with MRCOGs and FRCOGs?
But there was a difficulty in the Irish case, because although the fetus or the unborn child had no possibility of survival outside the womb, nonetheless it was felt that a rational precaution couldn't be taken to protect the health of Savita Halappanavar in that instance, because the fetus was still alive.
You're presuming. We don't know until there are findings.
Yes, I am presuming, and that's based on a presumption.
As far as I can see, in general terms, when there is sepsis in conditions like that, the only thing one can do is evacuate the contents of the womb, everything. Sometimes, if the infection has gone into the womb wall,
but in the Irish situation, where the unborn child is still alive,
you're presuming again, Vincent. I've spoken to obstetricians who said to me that they were absolutely happy under the guidelines that exist, that they would have been able to do what was necessary.
I know you
in that
have
case.
access to all these important people.
They're not important people. They're simple practitioners operating the tools of their trade, following the guidelines as they're supposed to do, and they found them, quote, crystal clear. They would have known. And they told me about cases where they had dealt with that were
these important people you talk about, if they told you it's crystal clear, it seems they're making a mistake. Because
perhaps that's the very case, Vincent. Perhaps that's it. Perhaps that's what it was. We don't know.
Because if in this case she was denied a termination of pregnancy because the fetus was still alive, then it seems to me that a risk was taken with regard to her life, which for no justifiable moral purpose, and that perhaps that resulted in her death ultimately. And what's talked about here with regard to the legislation for the S case doesn't deal with this.
Well, I accept that that's one possible scenario, and you are a barrister, you know there are many other scenarios that could be there too. For instance, it could be that the onset and the symptoms of this sepsis were so sudden, acute and overwhelming that even with the best medical care they couldn't be picked up in time and she couldn't have been looked after such that her life had been saved. On the other hand, it could be that the medical council guidelines and that the normal practice in relation to sepsis wasn't followed. We don't know. We don't know what has happened in this case, and it would be absolutely reckless to make policy on foot of it in the absence of the finding. And it has nothing to do with abortion. Anyway, despite the screaming headlines in the Irish Times.
They weren't screaming headlines.
They were
not
headlines.
Screaming headlines.
They made it from here to Sydney to Calcutta to
They weren't screaming
that
headlines.
women in Ireland were dying because we didn't have abortion. And the entire
the Irish Times, there was no
profession-
headline ever in the Irish Times suggested that. Not a single headline.
On Wednesday,
suggested
the
that.
first day, it was in quotes, but it was there.
Stated that her life would have been saved by having a termination. At no point.
What was the headline on the Wednesday?
The headline said, "Woman denied determination as she was, dies." Facts. And at no point in any of our reporting, which was meticulous and scrupulous, did we assert that her life would have been saved.
Okay, we've got to go to break. We've an extra break
termination.
tonight because we started the programme earlier than usual. So we'll take a break, and after the break, we're going to preview tomorrow morning's newspaper. Join us then.